Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Welcome back, wildlings. Today's rumblingly raucous reading, Part 4 of In the Hills, the Cities, by Clive Barker. Well, do we go back the way we came? It'll take us all night on foot. We'll hop a lift. Judd shook his head. His face was slack and his look lost. Don't you see, Mick? They all knew this was happening. The people in the farms. They got the hell out while those people went crazy up there. There'll be no cars along this road, I'll lay you anything, except maybe a couple of shit-dumb tourists like us, and no tourist would stop for the likes of us, not the way we look. He was right. They did look like butchers, splattered with blood, their faces shining with grease. Their eyes maddened. We'll have to walk, said Judd, the way he went. He pointed along the road. The hills were darker now. The sun had suddenly gone out on their slopes. Mick shrugged. Either way, he could see they had a night on the road ahead of them. But he wanted to walk somewhere, anywhere, as long as it put distance between him and the dead. In Popolok, a kind of peace reigned. Instead of a frenzy of panic, there was a numbness, a sheep-like acceptance of the world as it was. Locked in their positions, strapped, roped, and harnessed to each other in a living system that allowed for no single voice to be louder than any other, nor any back to bear labor less than its neighbors. They let an insane consensus replace the tranquil voice of reason. They were convulsed into one mind, one thought, one ambition. They became, in the space of a few moments, the single-minded giant whose image they had so brilliantly recreated. The illusion of petty individuality was swept away in an irresistible tide of collective feeling. Not a mob's passion, but a telepathic surge that dissolved the voices of thousands into one irresistible command. And that voice said, "Go." The voice said, "Take this horrible sight away where I never need see it again." So Popolek turned away into the hills, its legs taking strides half a mile long. Each man, woman, and child in that seething tower was sightless. They saw only through the eyes of the city. They were thoughtless, but to think the city's thoughts. And they believed themselves deathless in their lumbering, relentless strength, vast and mad and deathless. 2 miles along the road, Mick and Judd smelled petrol in the air, and a little further along, they came upon the VW. It had overturned in the reed-clogged drainage ditch at the side of the road, but it had not caught fire. The driver's door was opened, and the body of Vaslav Jalovsek had tumbled out. His face was calm, in unconsciousness. There seemed to be no sign of injury except for a small cut or two on his sober face. So they gently pulled the thief out of the wreckage and up out of the filth of the ditch onto the road. He moaned a little as they fussed about him, rolling Mick's sweater up to pillow his head and removing the man's jacket and tie. Quite suddenly he opened his eyes and stared at them both. "Are you all right?" Mick asked. The man said nothing for a moment. He seemed not to understand. Then, English?" he said. His accent was thick, but the question was quite clear. "Yes. I heard your voices. English." He frowned and winced. "Are you hurt? Are you in pain?" said Judd. The man seemed to find this amusing. Am I in pain?" he repeated, his face screwed up in a mixture of agony and delight. "I shall die," he said through gritted teeth. "No," said Mick, "you're all right." The man shook his head, his authority absolute. "I shall die," he said again, his voice full of determination. "I want to die." Judd crouched closer to him. His voice was weaker by the moment. "Tell us what to do," he said. The man had closed his eyes. Judd shook him awake, roughly. "Tell us," he said again, his show of compassion rapidly disappearing. "Tell us what this is all about." "About?" the man said, his eyes still closed. It was a fall. That's all, just a fall." "What fell?" "The city, Pt.4, my city." "Well, what did it fall from?" "Itself, of course." The man was explaining nothing, just answering one riddle with another. "Where were you going?" Mick inquired, trying to sound as unaggressive as possible. "After Popolak," the man said. "Popolak?" said Judd. Mick began to see some sense in the story. Popolak is another city, like Pt.4. Twin cities. They're on the map. "Where's the city now?" said Judd. Vaslav Jalovsek seemed to choose to tell the truth. There was a moment when he hovered between dying with a riddle on his lips and living long enough to unburden his story. What did it matter if the tale was told now? There would never be another contest. All of that was now over. "They came to fight," he said, his voice now very soft. "Popolak and Pt.4, they come every 10 years. "Fight?" said Judd. "You mean all those people were slaughtered?" Vaslav shook his head. No, they fell, I told you." "Well, how did they fight?" Mick said. "Go into the hills," was the only reply. Vaslav opened his eyes a little. The faces that loomed over him were exhausted and sick. They had suffered, these innocents. They deserved some explanation. "As giants," he said. "They fought as giants. They made a body out of their bodies. Do you understand? The frame, the muscles, the bone, the eyes, nose, teeth, all made of men and women." "He's delirious," Judd said. You go into the hills," the man repeated. "See for yourselves how true it is." "Well, even supposing," Mick began. Vaslav interrupted him, eager to be finished. "They were good at this game of giants. It took many centuries of practice. Every 10 years, making the figure larger and larger. One always ambitious to be bigger than the other. Ropes to tie them all together, flawlessly, sinews, ligaments. There was food in the belly, there were pipes from the loins to take away the waste. The best sighted sat in the eye sockets, the best voiced in the mouths and the throat. You wouldn't believe the engineering of it." "No, I don't," said Judd and stood up. "It is the body of the state," said Vaslav, so softly his voice was barely above a whisper. "It is the shape of our lives." There was a silence. Small clouds passed over the road, soundlessly shedding their mass into the air. It was a miracle," he said. It was as if he had realized the true enormity of that fact for the very first time. It was a miracle. And that was enough. Yes, it was quite enough. His mouth closed, the words said, and he died. Mick felt his death more acutely than the thousands that they'd fled from, or rather, this death was the key to unlocking the anguish that he felt for all of them. Whether the man had chosen to tell a fantastic lie as he died, or whether this story was in some way true, Mick felt useless in the face of it. His imagination was too narrow to encompass the idea. His brain ached with the thought of it, and his compassion cracked under the weight of the misery he felt. They stood on the road while the clouds scudded by, their vague gray shadows passing over them toward the enigmatic hills. It was twilight. Popelok could stride no further. It felt exhaustion in every muscle. Here and there, in its huge anatomy, deaths had occurred, but there was no grieving in the city for its deceased cells. If the dead were in the interior, the corpses were allowed to hang from their harnesses. If they formed the skin of the city, they were unbuckled from their positions and released to plunge into the forest below. The giant was not capable of pity. It had no ambition but to continue until it ceased. As the sun slunk out of sight, Popelok rested, sitting on a small hillock, nursing its huge head in its huge hands. The stars were coming out with their familiar caution. Night was approaching, mercifully bandaging up the wounds of the day, blinding eyes that had seen too much. Popelok rose to its feet again and began to move, step by booming step. It would not be long, surely, before fatigue overcame it, before it could lie down in the tomb of some lost valley and die. But for a space yet, it must walk on, each step more agonizingly slow than the last, while the night bloomed black around its head. Mick wanted to bury the car thief somewhere on the edge of the forest. Judd, however, pointed out that burying a body might seem, in tomorrow's saner light, a little suspicious. And besides, wasn't it absurd to concern themselves with one corpse when there were literally thousands of them lying a few miles from where they stood? The body, the man, was left to die, therefore, and the car to sink deeper into the ditch, and they began to walk again. It was colder and colder by the moment, and they were so hungry, but the few houses they passed were all deserted, locked, and shuttered, every single one. "What did he mean?" said Mick as they stood looking at another locked door. "He was talking metaphor, all that stuff about giants." "It was some Trotskyist tripe," Judd insisted. "I don't think so." "I know so. It was his deathbed speech. He'd probably been preparing it for years." "I don't think so," Mick said again and began walking back toward the road. "Oh, how's that?" Judd was at his back. He wasn't towing some party line. "Are you saying you think there's an actual giant around here someplace?" "For God's sake." Mick turned back to Judd. His face was difficult to see in the twilight, but his voice was sober with belief. "Yes, I think he was telling the truth." "That's absurd. That's ridiculous. No." Judd hated Mick at that moment. He hated his naivete, his passion to believe any half-witted story if it had a whiff of romance about it. And this was the worst, the most preposterous. "No," he began again. No. The sky was porcelain smooth, and the outline of the hills as pitch. "I'm fucking freezing," said Mick out of the ink. "Are you staying here, or are you walking with me?" Judd shouted. "We're not going to find anything this way." "Well, it's a long way back." "We're just going deeper into the hills." "You do what you like. I'm walking." His footsteps receded, the dark encased him, and after a minute, Judd followed. The night was cloudless and bitter. They walked on, their collars up against the chill, their feet swollen in their shoes. Above them, the whole sky had become a parade of stars, a triumph of spilled light, from which the eye could make as many patterns as it had patience for. After a while, they slung their tired arms around each other for comfort and for warmth. About 11 o'clock, they saw the glow of a window in the distance. The woman who greeted them at the door of the stone cottage didn't smile, but she understood their condition and let them in. There seemed to be no purpose in trying to explain to either the woman or her crippled husband what they'd seen. The cottage had no telephone, and there was no sign of a vehicle, so even if they had some way to express themselves, nothing could be done. With mimes and face-pullings, they explained that they were hungry and exhausted. They tried to further explain that they were lost, cursing themselves for leaving the phrase book back in the VW. She didn't seem to understand very much of what they said, but sat them down beside a blazing fire and put a pan of food on the stove to heat. They ate thick, unsalted pea soup and eggs, and occasionally smiled their thanks to the woman. Her husband sat beside the fire, making no attempt to talk, or even to look at the visitors. The food was good. It buoyed their spirits. Yes, it's starting to wind down, but don't think the scares are quite over yet. This is, after all, good old Clive. Stay scary, wildlings, and make the most of your nights.